Hello, and welcome to What is Innovation, the podcast that explores the reality of a word that is in danger of losing its meaning altogether. This podcast is produced by Outlast Consulting, LLC, a boutique consultancy that helps companies use innovation principles to solve their toughest business problems. I'm your host, Jared Simmons, and I'm so excited to have Mary Ann Jentz. Mary Ann founded MAJ Consulting to help organizations define and execute on strategic goals with a culture-first approach. Prior to founding MAJ Consulting, she worked at Deloitte as a strategy and operations consultant and in supply chain at General Electric. She has an MBA from Gozeta Business School at Emory University and bachelor's degrees in chemical engineering and psychology from the University of Notre Dame. She lives in Westchester, Ohio with her husband, Mike, and her Shih Tzu mix, Lulu. Mary Ann, welcome to the show. I'm so excited to talk to you today, as always.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited as well.
We talk all the time, and sometimes innovation comes up, but I'm really looking forward to hearing your specific thoughts on innovation and having you share the insights you share with me with the audience. So why don't we dive right in? What, in your mind, is innovation?
Yeah, such a great question. To me, innovation, and I've heard some of your past pod episodes, right, where people talk about specific product or business model or that type of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think you've had plenty of guests kind of define that in the past. And so I want to talk about maybe some of the other qualities around innovation.
Mm-hmm.
For me, innovation, it's intentional, yet unpredictable, and it has a bias toward action. And you might be going, what the heck does that, like, it's intentional, but it's unpredictable. Like, what does that even mean? How can it be both?
Sure.
One example that a lot of people may be familiar with from middle school or high school science class is the discovery of penicillin, right? You've got Alexander Fleming. He's got some Petri dishes. And I don't know how apocryphal this story is before your audience comes after me with the pitchforks of getting something wrong, but he's got Petri dishes. He's doing some experiments. He goes on vacation. He comes back and one of them is contaminated with mold. But he notices that the bacteria doesn't grow near the mold. So he gets curious and voila, we somehow get to penicillin.
Right.
Clearly, Fleming had an intention. Otherwise, why does he have the Petri dishes in the first place? And otherwise, why does he get curious when he notices something isn't quite right?
Right.
So the intention isn't necessarily directed at the innovation. It does happen, right? People all the time start companies that they set out with an intention to revolutionize and they do that thing. But there's intention, but it's not always in the direction of that innovation. So there's that piece of unpredictability, right? Or a lot of people start out with their startup idea and then it shifts over time, right? So there's that unpredictable piece of going, oh, the market's not going in that direction, right? So that's how it can be both things at the same time. And to me, those are very both, qualities of innovation that we need to keep in mind as we're thinking about it. That, it's the bias towards action, but we've got to have that flexibility to twist and turn as necessary.
Got it. That is helpful. And I think the added pressure, I love your definition because the separation of the intentional and unpredictable, I think it kind of gives people permission to come into things saying, you know what, this is my intention, but I understand that might not lead directly to the outcome I'm expecting. But having the intention makes you more likely to get to something that is innovative. I think it's because it drives focus. What do you think is so special about being intentional?
I agree with you that the driving of the focus. I also love how you said gives permission, right? It allows us to open our worlds and to think about, am I looking in the right direction? Am I really doing the thing that's going to give me a lot of bang for the buck, whether it be in business or just elsewhere, right? Not every innovation has to be, raking in the dollars.
Right, exactly.
I absolutely agree that the intention, to me, it's not only the focus, but it's that other phrase I use, the bias for action. I fail on this myself a lot of times. And so it's a reminder I have to bring to myself as like, I tend to be the person that gets a lot of books and wants to read and get perfect at a thing before I even try it.
Right.
But there's so much learning you do just by actually acting that I have to remind myself a lot. Come out of the book, go try the thing. Even if you're not good at it, it doesn't mean you won't discover something. And in a lot of cases, it's the people that aren't the experts in something that see something different and go, oh, here's potential for innovation.
Right. Right. Yeah. There's some serendipity in that activity.
Yes.
Like when you're out there doing things and colliding with things and, tripping over things and all of that stuff, you see things from different vantage points. And that bias toward action, I think, really reinforces the intentionality in, sort of exposing it to different stimuli. Because to me, the other thing I like about your definition is it doesn't push unpredictability out of the equation. A lot of times, you and I have done consulting work in big firms and things. And a lot of times you're trying to communicate that when you do this, this will happen. Right. And you give us this money, we will give you this solution and your life will be better. Right. Your company will be better. Good things will happen. That is a hypothesis. It's not a promise.
I can tell you, I don't think I've ever had a single scope of work go exactly as it was written.
That's right. Exactly.
And I purposefully try to give not just myself, but my clients the flexibility within that to say, let's see what we find.
Yeah.
And if we have to change, renegotiate, whatever, I am happy to be flexible. To your point, I really do want to do what is best for you and for your company. And sometimes what is best is not what we initially set out to do.
Right.
We discover a lot of things in that process of saying, oh, we thought this is what we were trying to do, but really we need to make a right turn and go somewhere else.
Right. And it's the activity in that process that gives you the insights to be able to pivot with intention.
Absolutely.
And if you don't have that action, you're almost guessing because you're not provoking sort of a response from the system,
Absolutely. 100% agree with you. I couldn't have said it better myself.
There's so much to unpack in this definition. I love it. How much time do you spend thinking about what you're going to do relative to action? So you've got the intentional and you've got the bias toward action. What's your ratio if you think about kind of the last, you know what I mean? How you operate on a day-to-day basis?
That is a really good question. And I'm like, I say that is really good. Like, I don't know the great, straight up answer for you. And the first thing that comes to my head in terms of actually answering your question is, it oftentimes depends on the stage of where I'm at with something, whether it be a new client engagement or me thinking about where my firm is going to go. Or frankly, I'm doing renovation on my house right now. Even me thinking about what part am I going to do next versus something else, right?
Exactly.
So at the beginning, right, if it's a new problem or a new challenge or a new client, or there's a lot of time up front for me gathering my thoughts spent in my head. But at some point I go, oh, this is swirling. I'm repeating too much. I'm not getting that action data, right? So I'd say at the beginning, it might be 80% of my time is really spent in the brain. But at some point I come to a hard stop where I'm like, oh, we got to start to act to see if these hypotheses, right? Because that beginning thinking part, a lot of times all that is are hypotheses.
Yeah, that's so true.
And then you've got to inch it. So with a new client, depending on the engagement, I like to spend at least the first 1 to 2 weeks listening. And it's not just to the executives I'm working with, but I want to talk to their direct reports. I want to talk to their their direct reports. I mean, I recently did a customer experience. I went all the way to the frontline associate. Can I listen to some customer calls?
Right.
Because, you're asking me to come in here and do customer experience. I need to understand what's actually going on with that customer before I can come do that.
Right.
And then once you get that exposure, you can kind of flip the script of it's 80% action, 20% still thinking, still studying. So it kind of swings really hard, the pendulum the other way.
Yeah.
And then you kind of recourse correct of, once you've swung really hard into action, you start to see what works and what doesn't. And so you maybe land in a more 70-30, 40-60, 50-50 spot, depending on what you're working on. Right. But I like to have kind of some thought out hypotheses and notes with potential results. Right. I'm the engineering nerd, like science bit, like I want to have my hypothesis and test it and see how it goes. So that's not necessarily how everybody works. But for me, I found a lot of time in my head, not for a long time,
right?
But the majority of my time in my head at the very beginning is good. And then kind of overcorrecting on action and then kind of landing right in that middle sweet spot is what has seemed to work for me.
That is a phenomenal way to kind of walk someone through that, process, because when we talk about innovation, it's very easy for it to be fluffy and not really connected to day-to-day life experience and work. And I think that mindset of being sort of 80-20 thinking on the front end, getting to that point where you're getting the same insights, you're starting to hear things and things are starting to come together, and then swinging to that 80-20 on the action side and never being 100-0, right?
Yeah, never 100.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing.
Yeah.
Even in the nonprofit world, I get people reaching out all the time about strategic plans. Can you, help us build our strategic plan? And the way the classical strategic planning process works, it's 100-0, right?
Yeah.
Let's pick a Saturday, and spend a day in a room together, and we're going to go through this process, and we're going to, spend a few months synthesizing everything. And then that's our thinking step. But there was no action in that process. The organization's sort of pausing on mid and long-term execution until it decides who and what it wants to be. And I think you lose a lot of momentum. But if you stay in that sort of 80-20 range and you're always swinging back and forth, there's always momentum and there's always pace and there's always activity. So I really like the way you laid that out.
And with that example that you just gave, look, to me, there's nothing wrong with taking a day to think, but there is something wrong with pausing all your mid and long-term activities to do that thinking, because I find that clients tend to go think in their best case scenario. They don't think about where they're at today.
Right.
They think about where they should be.
Yep.
I like keeping we can take a Saturday and plan it, but on Monday, let's see how that plan folds in. Are we meeting ourselves where we're at today?
Right. And that's the 20%.
Yeah, that's the 20%. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
That's why I liked that example you gave, because it just satiated from him. Like, yes, 100 times yes. The second your strategic plan does not meet your organization where it's at today, you're going to let it sit on the shelf and gather dust, because you're going to go, I don't know what to do because this doesn't seem to be working.
Right.
And that's usually not the case.
Yeah.
To your point, you need a bridge. I'm here today. I need to get there tomorrow.
Right.
Great. Let's find the trail.
Right.
There's no reason we can't get there, but don't expect to be on the trail tomorrow.
Right.
We've got to, craft that action to get there. And that's going to be at all levels too. I think that's the other thing that gets forgotten so often is that your highest, like your chief executive officer, your board, you all need to understand that. But also like your frontline, whether it be volunteer employee, but they all need to understand that.
Right.
Because if they don't, you're not going to execute.
Yeah. And back to your customer service example, they may not be in the room, but their perspective needs to be in the room.
Yes.
Right. And so that's why you spend the time to go all the way to the front line to get direct insights and observations and understanding, because you can now bring that back into that conversation so that you don't create something that is so, I feel like, there's a difference between something being so high level that it's not connected. And there's a difference between that and something being so disconnected from reality that it's not connected. And I feel like if you don't bring the insights into the high level conversation, you end up with something that's disconnected from reality, not just high level.
Absolutely.
And that's the part where, it gets stuck on the shelf because there's no reality in it. And you're off the pendulum swing, right? You're not even on the same axis with action, because it's a story you're telling yourself. And that's an easy trap for boards, senior executive teams to fall into, is falling in love with the stories they tell themselves.
I mean, that trap, I've created my whole career on that trap. And ideally, I would love to eliminate that trap, right? And say, let's let Mary Ann go do something. Let's let Mary Ann go be a painter, because we can all create these perfect strategies we can actually execute on. And essentially what I've built my firm on is saying, I know you have some idea of where you want to go, whether it is a clearly thought out, I did strategy in one day, but just don't know how to get to that next level. Or if it's, I just have some ideas and I need help formulating them to then get to the right. But that's, I've literally built my whole career off of that because I really saw that need.
Right.
Both in my past corporate experiences as well as my past consulting experiences. What kept resonating for me is exactly what you said. The reality did not match what was in the strategy. If we're not there yet, there's got to be a bridge.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so cool to kind of hear you talk about this in such concrete terms, not only because I think it's just helpful to think through, but also because, I know what a strategic thinker you are. And I think there's a lot of times people get locked into this either or sort of thinking about, oh, I'm a strategy, big picture, high level thinker, or, oh, no, I'm a manager in the weeds, detail oriented person. And, never the twain shall meet. But I feel like you embody the best of both worlds where you can think big and then execute on the details.
I appreciate that. Thank you. That's literally what I'm striving to be. With a lot of my clients, I end up working with individuals at all levels, kind of teaching them we all
Mhm.
need to be that. And there's different mixes of that.
Right.
As a board, as a chief executive officer, I probably need to be more towards the strategic side. Although with a CEO, I argue there's a strong execution element to that as well. And with your frontline associate, yeah, I don't need my customer service rep daydreaming 80% of the time about how, we strategically as a company should operate. But
Right.
I don't need them 100% of the time only on execution. I need part of that brain to say, you're the one that's living in it every day.
Mm.
What can I do better, faster, different, improve? Right. You're the one that's experiencing exactly in this example what our customers are going through. So I'd love to have your ideas at the table.
Mm.
And in a way, I don't want you to wait for me to ask you. I want you to feel comfortable and raise that hand or add that idea on my aha board or ping that email address we gave you, right? Like I do want people at every level thinking strategically and tactically. And it's just really what the mix of that strategic and tactical is for each of those roles. And it's going to be a little bit different.
Right, right. That's a great way of putting it. How do you strike that balance? And we talked a bit about this before we started recording, and I think you brought it up a bit, even in the episode so far. But how do you strike that balance for yourself when you're an employee or when you're an entrepreneur and you are trying to strike that balance in your own head? How do you do that?
I almost have to treat myself like my own client, frankly.
Yeah, 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 exactly.
Um, as I mentioned earlier in this conversation, I tend to accidentally lean towards the
Hmm.
think, and not necessarily act, right? And so I have to kind of be my own best. What would I tell Mary Ann if Mary Ann were coming to me in this situation,
Right.
right? And I'm terrible at accepting my own advice sometimes, and I really have to make a concerted effort, whether that's, you and I spitballing some
Hmm.
ideas,
Right.
right? Me talking to other independents, me talking to executives that I work with, or just me literally sitting down with pen and paper and saying, take my company name off of this, put company X. If company X came to me and said, I want to do this thing, right? This year it might be grow my firm, change my offerings, whatever it is. What would I tell them to do? Right.
Mm.
But I'm not a person who normally refers to myself in the third person,
Right.
but in those situations, I really have to, and I believe it. And I tell executives to do this all the time.
Hmm.
It's weird to refer yourself in the third person to a bunch of people, but when you're talking to yourself, I actually find that it helps me make a mental adjustment to say, hey, we're all better at giving advice than we are at taking it on our own.
Right.
So let's treat ourselves like our best friend
Mm.
and really look at it outside looking in, right? Trying to set our own emotions and ego and, our own hangups aside
Mm. Right.
and just look at here's the fact set.
Yeah.
Where would I tell you to go next? So for me, it's a mix of trying to take myself out of my shoes a little bit, put them in a client's shoes, and also just, involving other independent professionals, small firms, executives I trust to really talk about, change is happening all the time around us, right?
Yeah.
So how do I continue to adapt to best serve the needs of my clients as they're trying to adapt to the needs of our changing world?
Mm. And there's intentionality in that approach, right? You're taking intentional action around sitting down and having this sort of third person conversation or going through this third person exercise with yourself. And that's probably the gap between the way you're able to bring these things to life. And I'm reflecting on my own challenges in that area. And that's something I feel like I do in my head as the day's going along, like, oh, I need to do that or I need to,
Yeah.
but I stopped short of that intentional kind of exercise, that's an activity. And I think that's a really great way of doing it.
Honestly, I only found that activity from failing so many times in my own head. You see it because you're seeing my video with
Yeah.
the glass whiteboard behind me. That's where I do a lot. It's either that or this notebook sitting next to me. I have to get it out and really treat myself like another person.
Mm.
And there are times that I just have to call a friend and be like, I need you to give it to me straight
Right.
because my own emotion and ideas are getting in my own way. And I think that's the other thing I encourage everyone listening, right? Is call on a friend, whether that be another executive or another consultant, or maybe it's somebody totally outside your industry,
Yeah.
but somebody you trust that has a clear thinking. But it doesn't mean that everything they say is right or wrong. It's usually not so black or white.
Mm-mm.
It's not strategic or tactical. Right? It's a mix of all that. But call somebody you trust and have a conversation. Even if you don't agree with everything they say, what they say is going to spark ideas on you. Like earlier in this conversation, you mentioned that permission.
Mm-hmm.
I literally wrote that. I'm like, that's a new idea I didn't have before, right? This is something I can take to my clients and say, my view of the world is really giving you permission to try something new. Permission. That's such a powerful word.
Well, I'm glad something that came out was helpful. But yeah, because you're focusing on perspective and getting some sort of perspective on what you're doing, because we're all so close to what we're doing. And that perspective can either come directly from you by taking that step back and doing the activity, or bringing in someone that has that full sort of detachment that can provide that external perspective.
Absolutely.
That's fantastic. So we talked about what innovation is. What isn't innovation?
Ooh, I think I have so much more to say about what it isn't than what it is. I will hit on 3 points. I mean, there's probably 100 things we can say it isn't, right?
Yeah.
But it's not a guarantee for success.
Mm.
It is not detangled from our societal structures. As much as we sometimes like to pretend it is not. And here's the doozy as a third one. It is not inherently moral. We have a lot of innovations that could really tip us to the scales of something that we do not like as a society, right? So we can't act like every step forward is a step towards the good and the light.
Wow.
Or, whatever you believe in is that next step of advancement.
Wow. Yeah. So there's almost this altruistic element that kind of gets attached to some people's definition of innovation, but that's not always the case.
Exactly. 100%. Right. I feel like a lot of the conversations around innovation are like, it's so good. It's so light. It's so fluffy. We should all try to innovate. And I'm like, I don't necessarily disagree, but let me give you one example that's just very concrete in my head when we touch on this inherently moral part, right? I'm hearing a lot about gene splicing, gene editing right now.
Right.
And right now, that focus is really meant towards if somebody has like a terminal illness, right? Can we fix that genetically and give people a longer and hopefully healthier life?
Yeah.
I don't know too many people who would disagree about the morality of that. Now, I do know that there probably are some people that may have a religious moral exemption to that, right? So I don't want to make those individuals not feel heard.
Sure.
But generally speaking, I'm like, oh, if we can make an edit to a little gene and give somebody a longer, healthier life, great. But then let's apply that example to communities that have been built around disability. I myself do not suffer, or I shouldn't, I'm not myself like affiliated with any community of disability, right? But I hear their concerns in like different publications and on Twitter and those sort of things saying,
sure.
Are you suddenly going to say like, oh, we should splice genes and eliminate this thing? Because are you indirectly sending that message that like, I shouldn't exist, right? Does this borderline go towards like eugenics? And I hear that and I go, oh, yeah, if we're going to allow this technology to come in, we've got to be really careful. And then take that a step further. If I allow people to essentially design their babies.
Right.
I go, I think we all put up that flag and we go, this isn't necessarily the right thing to be doing. Right. So that assumption of morality, and I don't know if everybody is, but that light, airy feeling that comes around innovation, it scares me a little bit because we've all seen what's happened with social media.
Right.
I think 15 years ago, you would argue these are great things. And now today, the conversation is extremely mixed, possibly leaning towards a negative.
Right. And even positive things leading to negative outcomes in terms of, people posting only the wonderful things that are happening in their lives and other people kind of digesting this as a possible reality and judging themselves relative to it.
Yeah.
So, that's a great example because when all of this started, it was like, oh, I can talk to my friends or I can, post this or see what this other person posted and oh, this is great and interesting or whatever.
Yeah, it started with that friend connection. And then a lot of writers and artists were able to kind of build their community. Again, something I think is wonderful, right? That non-famous or not as well-known artists and writers had a way to reach community that they may have not had with the larger publishing houses and like talent representation, right? That I think a lot of people would assume that's good, but unfortunately there's a lot of unintended consequence with the network effects that have
Yeah.
been created there.
So true.
We see where we are today.
Yeah. That's an important conversation to have. And I hope this conversation sparks that thought in some other folks to really take a step back and think more deeply about innovation in terms of to what end and what does that mean for how we talk about and advocate for and invest in innovation for its own sake, which I think is where you can really start to decouple it from a positive outcome.
Yeah.
If you're innovating to deliver a benefit or to make society better, then you're talking about unintended consequences. But if you're innovating for innovation's sake, then bad things can happen.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to keep our eyes on both of those.
Yeah.
Even if a consequence is unintended,
Yeah.
I still had a hand in that.
Right.
And if it's not a good consequence, and I think that's where a lot of individuals have frustration right now, is we have a lot of like not so great unintended consequences, and it doesn't really feel like anybody's stepping up to take responsibility for those.
Well said. Well said. I want to go back to the second element of your what is an innovation, because my ears always perk up when someone talks about this space. So tell me more about that second element.
That detangling from our societal structure, right?
Yes.
I think the example that first came to my mind as I was thinking about how true or not true this particular element was Uber, right? And you might argue, well, that's totally out of our structure, right? We gave people a new way to work, we skipped the taxis, whatever. And I flip back and I go, the fact that we had medallions and special licenses and a yellow car, right, is part of this. Even if you're circumventing the structure, you're still part of that structure, right? Any idea that comes to mind is driven by the context in which you live. So unless you're literally a Martian coming to Earth, you yourself are part of that structure, whether you're in the quote unquote hierarchy, right? Because we all agree that people view right, wrong, or indifferent. There are hierarchies and people who are privileged and people who have less privilege, right?
Right.
But no matter where you sit on that hierarchy, you're still part of that structure. And so that is the context, the lens that is helping focus that innovation in a certain direction. Even if it's trying to change, dismantle, blow up a part of that structure, it's still 100% linked toward that structure, even if you're trying to take the whole thing apart. That point isn't meant to say innovation is bad because it falls within our structure, right? No, there's a lot of good innovation I see coming around the corner that could help make a more equitable society for us, right?
Right.
One example, I don't know if it's really going to do that or not, but I keep reading a lot more about Web3 and blockchain and this potential to give individual rights and income and ownership versus the big Web2 platforms.
Right.
Part of me goes, this is really cool and exciting, and what can we do with it? Another part of me goes, do the big operators just end up, quote unquote, owning most of Web3, but the ownership is obscured because everything is decentralized? So that's one example. Like it's still very much within our structure, even though it's different from the structure that we are mostly operating in today.
I see. It's kind of like a counterculture where, in order for something to be counterculture, it has to be defined again as the opposite of an established culture, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I can definitely see. You wouldn't have or understand the inherent value of Uber if there weren't an established medallion-driven yellow taxi cab environment and structure that was so pervasive and part of the fabric of culture. In order to be the anti-something, that something has to exist.
That's correct.
Yeah, that's a phenomenal point. For me, what I'm taking away from that in particular is, in order to define yourself relative to something else, or the minute you start to do that, do you take your eye off of the benefit that you're trying to provide, the problem you're trying to solve? Because to be the anti-taxi, maybe you start to think about, okay, well, these are the signals, these are the attributes that make a taxi a taxi. But those don't all necessarily conflict with the delivery of the benefit. And so I think sometimes features get thrown out for the sake of being different. Things that could benefit the consumer or the end user get tossed out because they are indicative or represented by the sort of mainstream. Like Web 3.0 is going to not do things that could be useful because they were part of Web 2.0 and they want to be seen. It needs to be seen as different.
I think you make a fantastic point there. And I think to concrete that example, I mean, if you think about when you go to the airport and get an Uber, you don't wait in an Uber line. You sit there in an app and you have to look for a specific car. How inefficient is that?
Yeah. And they call you and you
And
miss
they
the
call
call,
you and
then
they're
you call
looking
them.
for, yeah. And so I'm just like, the part about the taxi that worked was the fact that when I'm at the airport, I just get the next one.
Yep.
That's the thing about that worked, right? But Uber doesn't, and I'm sure there's some regulation around why Uber doesn't do that. But I'm saying, like,
Yeah.
if Uber could find a way to do that, we would all be having a better, like, I hate Uber at the airport. I love Uber to the airport.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
I've literally done that in Atlanta multiple times, where when I'm going to the airport, right? I didn't live where a lot of taxis went around, so fine.
Right.
But coming from the airport, it's a flat rate. It's usually competitive with Uber, and I just can get in the line. It's easy.
Oh, wow. That's that is a great
pro tip for those
example.
In Atlanta.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's no shortage of need for managing Atlanta Hartsfield Airport. I mean, there's probably a masterclass just that could be delivered on that alone.
Yeah, go to the international terminal when you're leaving too. You save a lot of time.
Oh, that's a good one. That's a really good one.
I'm changing your podcast format here.
No. These are great. I just don't want to give too many of them away because
you're like, I want to use them myself.
Yeah, you and I won't get the benefit of them that we normally do. Mary Ann, this has been another amazing conversation. I always learn a lot and laugh a lot with you, and it's always a genuine pleasure. Before I let you go, do you have any advice that you would offer innovators out there?
Yes. And Jared, before I get to that advice, it's absolutely been a pleasure. Same. I always laugh and have a great time with you. My advice to those innovators, it's twofold. First of all, don't be limited by that word innovator. And I think this is one I've struggled with, right? Where I don't always view myself as an innovator. I have a couple executives who I do a lot of work with. And a few years back told one of them, oh, well, we're a perfect match because you're the big idea thinker and I make it happen. Just because you're not coming up with the next Uber or the next iPhone or whatever does not mean you are not an innovator, right? You don't have to publish a book to be an author or writer, right? And I know sometimes it's hard to apply those labels to yourself. So even if you don't want to call yourself an innovator, just recognize that there is innovation all over the place. And you don't have to come up with that next biggest thing to like have a hand in that innovation. And then the second fold of that advice is to stay curious. And I get those two words together. That's big and general and cliche. So I'm big on tangible examples.
Yeah.
My tangible example for how you can stay curious starts with the phrase, always assume good intent unless you're writing a contract. And what I mean by that, I know any of my clients listening to this are probably going to roll their eyes because I say it so much. And I say, when you're embarking on this like innovation journey or just this journey to like any work you're doing, right?
Yeah.
Try to handle most of your pitfalls up front, the part I call writing the contract. So that can literally mean if you're partnering with somebody, writing a legal agreement. It can mean within your organization, if it's like you're in business and you're working with the IT group, laying some boundaries to say, when things don't go our way, right, here's like our solid agreement. This is how we handle that, because that frees you up to assume good intent for the rest of that engagement. So if I'm working closely with Isaiah from accounting, I don't know any Isaiahs in accounting, so if this feels targeted to anybody, it's not. And he keeps asking me questions, right? He needs to know this, he needs to know that. And I'm just going, I don't have time, right? I'm getting all these pings. I don't know what's going on. If I assume bad intent, we're just going to butt heads and we're both going to be angry, right? And we're not going to get anything done, right? It's going to be that same dance every month. He needs to know these 100 things. I don't have time. If I assume good intent, I can say, hey, Isaiah, I noticed you have a lot of accounting requests. However, they're quite intrusive. Can I understand what exactly you need? What's driving these so we can get you the information you need in like a better way for both of us, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if I stay curious, and I know that example wasn't really innovative, but the point is, if I stay curious, it opens the door to what is the path of least resistance towards getting to that next step, getting to that next place, having a better relationship with that person. And I'm saying to start with the assumption of good intention. You might find in your exploration that that person is not well intended. And that's when you fall back to what's going on in that contract, right? We
Mm-hmm.
agreed to certain standard, but 80% of the time or more, I found that people generally have good intent and that the hunkering of our corporate silos keep us away from that spontaneity, that uncertainty that exists within innovation, right? So
Yeah.
if you assume good intent, it kind of removes that misalignment of incentives. It helps remove any miscommunication. And it just says, hey, at the end of the day, what are we all trying to get towards? And it allows you to get one step closer there with less resistance. Because that's what I see so much. Honestly, my clients, big and small, you have to be really small not to have that kind of like internal siloing start to happen.
Right. Right. I know you said it wasn't an innovative example, but it's a fantastic example of how innovation works and how it doesn't work. Because you can put a big innovative plan together, but what's going to make it go or not go is the quality of the relationship you have with Isaiah, because you can't get anything done without partnership from other people. And so it's an element of innovation that doesn't get discussed enough. So thank you for highlighting that.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. This was awesome. I really enjoyed it. It went by so quickly.
Well, I'm glad you enjoyed it, and it's been super useful for me and informative. And I've got a bunch of notes I've taken to continue to think about some of the things you've shared with us. So thanks again for your time, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Absolutely. Same here. Thank you.
All right, take care. We'd love to hear your thoughts about this week's show. You can drop us a line on Twitter at Outlast LLC, OUTLAST LLC, or follow us on LinkedIn where we're Outlast Consulting. Until next time, keep innovating, whatever that means.